Watch that reaction again, because that wasn't excitement, it wasn't pride, it was panic. The kind of pause that happens when someone realizes a line has been crossed and there's no taking it back. In one sentence, everything shifted. A major network said something out loud that people in the league had been quietly trying not to say for months. And the moment it happened, you could feel it. Not celebration, not unity, tension. Because this wasn't a hot take from social media. This wasn't a podcast clip farming engagement. This came from the top. A voice that speaks for billion-dollar decisions, advertising strategy, and long-term broadcast plans. And what they said instantly rewrote the power dynamics of professional basketball. They didn't just praise a player, they elevated her above everyone else. Men, women, veterans, legends, everyone. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The statement didn't frame her as a future star. It didn't hedge or soften the language. It didn't put her in a category or restrict the comparison. The words were clear and absolute. The most iconic figure in basketball. Not women's basketball, not college. Basketball, period. That's the kind of sentence executives usually spend weeks debating before it ever reaches a microphone. And once it's out there, it can't be unseen. What makes this moment so explosive isn't just who was praised, it's who wasn't consulted. Because the same network that made this declaration also broadcast WNBA games. The same network financially tied to the league just told the world that one rookie mattered more to the sport's relevance right now than every established NBA superstar they air night after night. That's not accidental language, that's data talking. For any league, that should be a victory lap. That should be the headline you plaster everywhere. That should be the kind of endorsement you frame and hang in the office. A broadcast partner with access to private metrics, internal projections, and long-term engagement data just crowned your player as the center of the basketball universe. Most leagues would sprint toward that moment. Instead, the reaction was hesitation. And that's when people started asking the question that changed everything. Why did this feel awkward? Why didn't it sound like a celebration? Why did it land more like a disruption than a triumph? Because buried underneath that glowing praise was a quiet contradiction, one that exposed a fault line the league has been trying to manage without drawing attention to it. You see, for everyone's watching casually, this sounded obvious. Fans had already felt the shift. Ticket sales, TV ratings, social buzz, the energy around games that suddenly mattered more. None of that came as a surprise. But for the people inside the system, this statement threatened something much bigger than credit. It challenged the story the league had been telling about itself. This wasn't just about one player being popular. It was about control of the narrative, who gets credit, who drives growth, and how comfortable the league is admitting what the audience already knows. Because once a network like this speaks so plainly, it puts pressure on everyone else to respond, whether they want to or not. And here's the detail that makes this moment even heavier. That statement didn't come during a championship run. It didn't come after a marketing campaign. It came during a fragile window, when the league is negotiating its future, measuring its leverage, and trying to prove long-term viability. Timing like that isn't neutral. It amplifies consequences. Almost immediately, people began connecting dots, not because they wanted drama, but because the contrast was impossible to ignore. A league preaching collective growth and a broadcast partner highlighting an individual dominance. A league emphasizing balance and a network spotlighting a single gravitational force. Two messages moving in opposite directions at the exact same time. And that's why this moment matters. Not because someone said something bold, but because it accidentally revealed a truth everyone had been circling around without naming. The league and its most powerful media partner are not telling the same story anymore. And once that disconnect becomes public, it stops being philosophical, it becomes strategic. Because the question now isn't whether the statement was accurate, the numbers have already answered that. The real question is whether the league is ready to live with what that accuracy implies, and what happens if they don't.
The reason NBC's statement landed so hard isn't about hype. It's about who said it and how rarely this kind of language is ever used. This didn't come from a commentator chasing a viral clip. It came from inside the machine, an executive producer, someone whose job isn't storytelling, but measurement. Someone whose entire role revolves around ratings curves, advertiser reactions, minute-by-minute audience retention, and long-term brand value. When a person like that speaks, they're not guessing. They're summarizing spreadsheets most fans will never see. That's what a lot of people missed in the initial reaction. This wasn't praise, this was an assessment. Networks don't elevate one athlete above every other active superstar unless the data forces them there. They don't casually announce who the most relevant figure in a sport is because relevance has a dollar value attached to it. It affects ad rates, it shapes programming decisions, it determines where cameras go, which games get flexed, and who anchors future coverage. Words like iconic don't appear in executive language unless the trend lines are overwhelming. And it matters even more because this came from NBC, a network that sits at the center of the basketball ecosystem. They're not outsiders. They don't benefit from stirring drama between leagues. In fact, they usually work overtime to keep relationships smooth. That's why this statement was so jarring. It cut through the usual corporate caution. No qualifiers, no one of the most, no time frame limitations, just a clean declaration that reset the hierarchy. There's another layer here that made the statement impossible to ignore. NBC covers the NBA. The same network airs games featuring LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Giannis Antetokounmpo, players with decades of brand equity and global reach. By placing a WNBA rookie above all of them in terms of current relevance, NBC wasn't disrespecting those stars. They were acknowledging a present-moment reality, momentum, cultural gravity, the kind that shows up when casual fans change their habits. That's why advertisers and sponsors pay attention when statements like this happen, because relevance isn't about legacy, it's about what people are choosing to watch right now. It's who pulls viewers away from everything else competing for attention. The NBA has icons, but at this moment, none of them were moving audiences the way this one player was. NBC didn't need to say that publicly, they chose to. And that choice signals confidence in the data backing it up. This also explains why the reaction inside basketball circles felt so tense. When a network makes an evaluation like that, it effectively overrules internal messaging. It tells agents, sponsors, and media partners where the value sits. It influences who gets meetings, who gets featured, and whose presence guarantees numbers. Whether the league agrees or not almost becomes irrelevant because the business ecosystem responds to the broadcaster with leverage. And that's why this moment can't be brushed off as a comment taken out of context. It wasn't phrased emotionally. It wasn't amplified by social media hype first. It emerged fully formed from the top of the broadcast food chain, which means every decision maker listening immediately understood what it implied. Someone inside the system just admitted something out loud that everyone had been quietly adjusting to behind the scenes. The real impact of NBC's statement wasn't public praise, it was alignment. It aligned what fans were feeling with what the data was showing. And once those two things line up, the conversation changes. Because now the question isn't whether this player matters most, it's why the league seems hesitant to say the same thing. And that discomfort is where things start to unravel. The league's response is what quietly turned this into a problem, not because they attacked the statement, not because they denied it outright, but because their official position already said something completely different, and it was said on purpose. Weeks earlier, after the season wrapped, the WNBA released formal communications celebrating what they called a historic year. Record attendance, increased visibility, growing engagement. And inside that messaging, they made a very deliberate choice about who deserved credit. In that statement, the league highlighted Alyssa Thomas as the primary reason fans came to games throughout the season, not just during the playoffs, not just in marquee matchups, regular season attendance. That detail matters. This wasn't an offhand compliment or a feel-good quote. It was presented as cause and effect. Fans showed up, according to the league, because of her. Now, to be clear, Alyssa Thomas absolutely deserves recognition. She's one of the most complete players in the league, a relentless competitor, a triple-double threat who does everything that doesn't always show up in highlight packages. There's nothing wrong with praising her impact. That's not where this went sideways. The issue is what that praise was positioned against, because by crediting her as the central driver of attendance growth, the league was indirectly making a statement about who wasn't, and that's where the messaging backfired. The timing alone raised eyebrows. This was coming off a season where one rookie dominated headlines, broke records, and fundamentally changed how often the league was mentioned in mainstream sports conversations. Yet the league chose to spotlight someone else as the reason arenas were filling up.
That choice wasn't accidental. It reflected a deeper philosophy the league has consistently tried to maintain, a belief that success should be framed as collective, not individual, that no single player should be elevated above the rest, that growth belongs to everyone. On paper, that sounds noble, but in practice, it created a narrative that clashed with what casual fans had just spent months experiencing. Because the people buying last-minute tickets didn't come armed with press releases. They came because of buzz. They came because they'd heard about one player non-stop and wanted to see what the hype was about. They came because games involving the Indiana Fever suddenly felt like events. When the league credited someone else as the primary draw, it didn't feel inclusive, it felt disconnected. And the backlash didn't come from disrespect, it came from confusion. Fans weren't saying Alyssa Thomas didn't matter. They were asking why the most obvious explanation for the league's surge was being downplayed, especially when the numbers lining up with that surge were so visible. When attendance spikes followed one specific schedule, when road games sold out based on one name alone. That's why NBC's statement landed like a shockwave. It didn't just offer praise, it directly contradicted the league's carefully curated message. On one side, a broadcast partner saying the quiet part out loud. On the other, a league insisting growth came from somewhere else. Both can't simultaneously be true in the way they were framed. And once people noticed that contradiction, it became impossible to ignore. What should have been a moment of alignment turned into a moment of exposure. The league's official position, meant to reinforce unity, ended up highlighting the gap between how insiders want the story to be told and how the outside world is already telling it. And when that gap gets that wide, the narrative starts slipping out of your control. Because once the audience senses that what they're being told doesn't match what they're seeing, trust erodes, not in the product, but in the messaging. And that's where things move from awkward to problematic, especially when your biggest media partner is openly pointing in the opposite direction. Once you strip away the statements and philosophies, the numbers tell a much simpler story, and they do it without emotion, without loyalty, and without politics. They just follow attention. During the 2024 season, every measurable indicator of growth traced back to one place. Games involving Caitlin Clark didn't just perform well, they behaved differently than the rest of the league's schedule. Start with attendance. The Indiana Fever didn't see a modest bump. Their home attendance effectively exploded compared to the previous season. Entire sections that once struggled to fill suddenly sold out. But the more revealing metric wasn't home games, it was the road. When the Fever traveled, arenas filled in cities that hadn't seen sellouts in years. Teams quietly moved games into larger venues. Prices jumped. Secondary markets reacted instantly. You don't get that kind of response from league-wide goodwill. You get it from demand tied to one attraction. Television data told the same story. Games featuring Indiana drew rating spikes regardless of opponent or market size. It didn't matter if they were playing a contender or a struggling team. Viewership climbed simply because Clark was on the floor. Networks didn't have to promote matchups. The presence of her name alone shifted national interest. That's not branding, that's gravitational pull. Then there's engagement, the metric every modern league obsesses over because it predicts future revenue better than anything else. Social clips featuring her didn't just perform well, they outperformed league averages by multiples. Highlights trended beyond traditional basketball audiences. Comment sections filled with people openly admitting they'd never watched a WNBA game before. That matters more than raw numbers. It means new eyeballs entered the ecosystem, not just existing fans watching more.
Merchandise followed the same pattern. Jerseys sold out, team stores couldn't keep up, and this wasn't just in Indiana. Neutral fans bought in because they wanted a connection to the story everyone was talking about. That's how stars function economically. They convert attention into action, and the conversion rate here was impossible to miss. What's important is that none of this required interpretation. These weren't cherry-picked stats or opinion-driven narratives. They were direct behavioral signals from fans. People voted with their time, their money, and their screens. When Clark played, interest jumped. When she didn't, it normalized. The contrast was clean enough that even casual observers picked up on it halfway through the season. That's why the league's messaging felt off to so many viewers. Not insulting, just misaligned. Because while official statements tried to spread credit evenly, the audience was responding unevenly. And audiences don't lie, they don't coordinate, they react instinctively, which is why broadcast partners pay closer attention to what people do than what organizations say. By the time NBC made its statement, the conclusion had already been reached internally. The numbers didn't suggest one important player among many. They pointed to a single catalyst accelerating everything around her. And once that pattern becomes obvious, ignoring it doesn't preserve balance, it creates disbelief. And that disbelief is what set the stage for the next clash. Because when hard data runs headfirst into philosophical messaging, only one of them survives public scrutiny. And that's where this stops being about popularity and starts becoming a strategic dilemma the league can't sidestep. At the center of this entire debate is a collision between two ways of thinking that don't peacefully coexist. On one side, you have the WNBA's long-standing philosophy, one built around balance, collective growth, and the idea that no single player should ever rise so far above the rest that the league becomes about them alone. It's a message rooted in fairness. Everyone contributes, everyone matters. Success belongs to the group. On the other side is the philosophy every major sports broadcaster and advertiser quietly operates by. Stars drive ecosystems, not because they're more deserving as people, but because that's how human attention works. Casual fans don't discover leagues first, they discover names. They don't fall in love with structures, they fall in love with stories anchored by individuals. And once they're in, they start noticing everyone else. The WNBA's approach makes sense culturally. It protects players from being overshadowed, it reinforces internal unity, it avoids resentment and hierarchy, but it runs straight into a wall when confronted with how the sports business actually functions. Because the moment a breakout star appears, one who pulls in audiences that weren't there before, the league faces a choice: amplify it or soften it. Broadcast partners like NBC don't have the luxury of softening reality. They live in results, ratings, engagement, advertiser confidence. Their philosophy isn't about equality, it's about momentum. When they see a surge tied to one person, their instinct isn't to average it out, it's to lean in, maximize exposure, ride the wave while it's cresting. This is where comparison becomes unavoidable. The NBA never tried to pretend its biggest stars weren't central to its growth. Entire eras were built around singular figures. When Michael Jordan dominated, the league didn't downplay it to protect balance, it expanded globally. When LeBron James became the face of basketball, the NBA didn't hesitate to put him everywhere. That visibility didn't hurt the league, it lifted everyone in it. The same is true in the NFL. Patrick Mahomes is everywhere, and nobody interprets that as disrespect to the rest of the roster. It's understood that stars are entry points. They're not exclusions, they're invitations. Fans come for the name and stay for the competition.
The WNBA, however, is trying to grow while resisting that exact mechanism. It wants the benefits of star-driven attention without embracing the hierarchy that comes with it. And that's where the tension lies. Because when your broadcast partner openly elevates one player as the most relevant figure in the sport, it forces the issue.
The league can either align with that reality or continue framing success in a way that contradicts what new fans are actually responding to. What makes this collision so visible now is timing. The league finally has a star who crosses cultural boundaries, someone recognizable to people who don't normally watch, someone whose presence changes behavior. And instead of simplifying the message, "This is our moment," the league's philosophy complicates it. It adds qualifiers where momentum demands clarity. Neither philosophy is inherently wrong. Collective values matter. So does equitable recognition. But in moments like this, refusing to prioritize attention can cost growth. Because attention is fleeting. It doesn't wait for consensus. It doesn't pause while organizations debate messaging. It moves on. And that's why this isn't just a philosophical disagreement anymore. It's a practical one. One side is saying this is how audiences behave. The other is saying this is how we want the league to feel. And when those two ideas collide, the outcome determines not just who gets credit, but whether the opportunity lasts long enough to matter. By the time this debate reached mainstream attention, the pattern had already been hiding in plain sight. It didn't start with NBC. It surfaced earlier in smaller media moments that, on their own, seemed forgettable. But when stacked together, they revealed a consistent instinct: deflect individual elevation, even when the comparison strained credibility. One of the clearest examples came from a public exchange involving Sheryl Swoopes. During a discussion about the Indiana Fever, a remark was reported suggesting that Katie Lou Samuelson was just as important to the team's success as Caitlin Clark. The exact wording later became disputed, and clarifications followed. But that wasn't the part that stuck with people. What lingered was the framing itself. The conversation immediately shifted away from whether the claim made basketball sense and toward whether the quote was technically accurate. Semantics replaced substance. Numbers were treated as optional context, and anyone who questioned the comparison wasn't met with counter-evidence. They were accused of overreacting or misunderstanding intent. That response told fans more than the original comment ever could. Because this wasn't about disrespecting Samuelson, a solid role player who contributes within her role. It was about the unwillingness to clearly acknowledge impact when that impact is lopsided. One player was breaking rookie records, leading the league in assists, and fundamentally altering how the team functioned. The other averaged single-digit points and filled a complementary role. Treating those contributions as interchangeable didn't promote equality, it diluted reality. And this wasn't an isolated moment. Similar framing popped up repeatedly across media coverage. Whenever Clark's impact became impossible to ignore, the conversation bent toward balance. Phrases like equally important, system-driven, or collective effort appeared as reflexive shields. The goal wasn't analysis, it was moderation. Keep the conversation from centering too hard on one person, even if that's where the evidence pointed. What made these moments stand out is how they were handled after the fact. Instead of engaging with why fans reacted so strongly, discussions focused on tone policing. Critics were framed as aggressive, pushback was labeled unfair. The underlying question, why acknowledging a breakout star felt so uncomfortable, was rarely addressed head-on. These media moments functioned like small stress tests, and each time the same instinct showed up. Protect the collective narrative, even if it means stretching logic. Avoid elevating one player too far above the group, even when the gap is obvious. In isolation, that instinct might seem harmless, but repeated over time, it trained audiences to expect a disconnect between what they were seeing on the court and what they were hearing discussed around it. That's why the NBC statement felt so disruptive. It didn't follow the pattern. It didn't soften the edges. It didn't hedge. It said the thing everyone had learned not to say publicly. And by doing that, it exposed just how rehearsed the alternative messaging had become. Once that contrast was visible, everything clicked into place. Those earlier media moments weren't accidents or one-off missteps. They were symptoms of a broader approach, one that consistently prioritized narrative balance over analytical clarity. And now, that approach was being challenged, not by fans or commentators, but by the most powerful voice in the broadcast room.
Up until now, this debate could be brushed off as messaging noise, philosophical disagreement, media tension, nothing that felt immediately dangerous. But then the calendar turned, and suddenly the stakes weren't theoretical anymore. They became structural, financial, existential, because the league is walking straight into one of the most sensitive periods in its history.
The WNBA is approaching critical collective bargaining negotiations, and those talks aren't happening in a vacuum. Revenue expectations are higher than ever. Players want a piece of the growth they're being told is real. Improved salaries, better conditions, long-term security. On the other side, the league has to prove that this surge isn't temporary, that it can sustain momentum beyond one lightning strike season. This is where the messaging disconnect stops being cosmetic, because leverage in negotiations depends on perceived stability. If growth appears tied to a fleeting cultural moment, owners get cautious. If it's framed as broad and system-driven, confidence is easier to sell. That context explains why the league might be tempted to spread credit evenly, but it also explains why the risk is so high. There's been quiet speculation that if negotiations break down, a work stoppage could be on the table. That's not a certainty, just something people around the league have openly discussed. And even the possibility of a missed season changes everything. For most players, it means going overseas, waiting it out, hoping attention returns. But for one player in particular, timing is everything. Caitlin Clark is relevant right now because she's accessible. She's on national television. She's playing in front of American audiences. She's part of the daily sports conversation. Remove her from that ecosystem, even temporarily, and the momentum doesn't pause. It shifts. Casual fans don't follow labor disputes. They don't track overseas box scores. They move on. This isn't hypothetical. The best players in the world have played overseas for years with almost no mainstream American attention. Not because they weren't talented, but because the environment wasn't visible. Different time zones, limited coverage, no cultural presence. That gap is where relevance quietly disappears, and relevance, once lost, is brutally hard to recapture. That's why this moment feels so tense. The league finally has leverage in the form of attention, real attention, not niche buzz, not internal optimism, external demand. And yet, its internal messaging seems designed to dampen reliance on the very thing creating that leverage. That's not just inconsistent, it's dangerous. Because if talks stall and momentum breaks, the league doesn't just lose a season, it risks losing the audience it just acquired. Fans who showed up for the first time don't come with lifelong loyalty, they come with curiosity. If that curiosity isn't fed continuously, it fades. The window doesn't stay open out of sympathy. This is why NBC's statement matters so much in this phase. It signals that outside partners are planning around star power, regardless of what the league decides. Broadcasters hedge, they protect assets, they don't assume ideal outcomes. And if a network values one individual enough to build contingency plans, that should trigger urgency. The stakes aren't about ego or credit anymore. They're about timing, about whether the league understands how fragile momentum really is. Because moments like this don't announce how long they'll last. They just test whether you're willing to act like they matter before they're gone. From NBC's perspective, this situation is painfully simple. They're not debating philosophy, they're managing assets. When a broadcaster identifies someone who reliably pulls audiences across platforms, that person stops being just an athlete and starts becoming part of a larger portfolio. And right now, Caitlin Clark sits squarely in that category. Networks don't think season to season, they think ecosystem to ecosystem. One league feeds another, one broadcast window supports the next. NBC isn't just airing games, they're curating a basketball pipeline that spans studio shows, highlight packages, digital clips, crossover appearances, and future rights negotiations. When they see a figure who can anchor all of that, protecting the connection becomes a priority, regardless of league-level uncertainty. That's why NBC's language was so confident. They weren't just talking about what she's doing on the court, they were talking about what happens when her name appears on a rundown. Ratings stabilize, engagement jumps, clips travel beyond traditional basketball circles, conversations spill into spaces that normally wouldn't care. From a network standpoint, that's rare, and you don't treat rare assets delicately, you secure them.
If the league stumbles, NBC still benefits from keeping her visible. Studio appearances, guest analysis, features during NBA coverage. They can maintain continuity even if the WNBA calendar becomes unpredictable. That's not disloyalty to the league, it's risk management. Broadcasters always hedge against volatility, especially during labor talks or transitional periods.
This also explains why NBC's framing focused on relevance, not affiliation. They weren't saying she belongs to one league or another. They were saying she belongs to basketball's cultural center. That distinction gives them flexibility. It allows them to position her wherever attention is strongest without being boxed into one organizational narrative. And here's the subtle part. By protecting their investment this way, NBC is signaling confidence in her longevity, not just her moment. Networks don't build long-term cross-platform strategies around short-term trends. They do it when they see repeatability, when attention doesn't evaporate after novelty wears off. That belief is baked into how aggressively they're willing to speak. The contrast with the league's approach becomes clearer here. NBC is acting like a company that understands windows close, that relevance compounds only if it's continuously reinforced, that you don't wait for perfect alignment before capitalizing on momentum. You move early, loudly, and decisively. Whether the league follows or not, NBC's strategy is already in motion. They're keeping the connection intact. They're ensuring that the audience they captured doesn't drift. And in doing so, they've implicitly answered a question the league is still wrestling with. What happens when star power becomes too valuable to slow down for consensus? When you step back and connect every piece of this, the choice in front of the league becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't about one comment. It isn't about one executive or one headline. It's about whether the WNBA is willing to align its public identity with the reality unfolding in front of it, or whether it continues trying to reshape that reality through messaging alone. On one path is the comfort of consistency, a league that emphasizes equality, collective success, and shared credit above all else. That approach protects internal harmony and feels principled, but it also risks undercutting the very momentum that finally pulled new eyes into the sport. Because momentum doesn't care about intentions, it responds to clarity. And right now, clarity points to one undeniable catalyst. On the other path is growth through honesty, a willingness to say, without apology, that a breakout star changed the temperature of the league, that acknowledging her impact doesn't diminish anyone else, it magnifies the stage they're standing on. This isn't about turning the WNBA into a one-player show. It's about accepting that audiences enter through stars and stay for competition, storylines, and community. The league doesn't need to abandon its values to make this work. Both things can be true at once. You can champion the collective while recognizing the engine driving attention. Other leagues have done it for decades. They didn't collapse under the weight of star power. They expanded because of it. The rising tide didn't erase teammates. It elevated them. What makes this moment so urgent is timing. Opportunities like this don't arrive on a schedule. They don't linger while organizations debate how to feel about them. They appear, demand action, and disappear just as quickly if mishandled. Casual fans aren't patient. Media cycles move fast. Cultural focus drifts the moment friction replaces excitement. NBC has already made its choice. They've identified the asset, they've spoken plainly, they're moving forward as if relevance matters more than comfort. The league can either walk alongside that momentum or find itself explaining years from now why the window closed before it fully opened. This isn't about being right, it's about being ready. Ready to accept that growth doesn't always arrive in the neat, evenly distributed way we hope it does. Sometimes it arrives through one person at exactly the right moment, and the only real decision is whether you let that moment carry you forward or quietly pass you by.